Welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah.
Today, we're diving deep into groups, those fascinating clusters of people that make up so much of our lives.
Yeah, it's such a rich area to explore, and we've got some really cool academic research to guide us.
Absolutely. We're going way beyond those everyday assumptions about groups and really getting into the nitty-gritty.
The how and the why, they work the way they do, and hopefully offer some insights you can actually use.
Okay, so first things first. What is a group, really? I mean, we all use the word, but I'm guessing it's more than just, a bunch of people hanging out.
You're right. It's got to have some key ingredients interaction among the members, definitely a shared goal that they're working towards.
Makes sense.
Some level of interdependence, like they rely on each other to some extent.
Okay,
A stable relationship over time. It can't just be a fleeting thing.
got it.
And that feeling of we're in this together, that recognition that they belong.
So not just a random crowd waiting for the bus. There needs to be that sense of shared purpose and identity.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is how early this drive to form groups emerges. Even little kids naturally gravitate towards creating their own little groups.
Like my kids, they always had their little posses.
Right. And it shows just how innate that need for belonging is and how groups are vital for our development, even from a very young age.
So we're hardwired for this group thing. Now, once a group forms, it's not static, right? It goes through changes.
You got it. Our sources talk about Tuckman's model of group development and others that outline these stages a group goes through.
Yeah, like a journey.
Exactly, it's a journey. Tuckman starts with forming, that initial phase where everyone's a bit unsure, figuring out the lay of the land. Then comes storming.
Ah, yes, storming. We've all been there.
Right. Conflict disagreements emerge, which can feel chaotic, but it's actually crucial for the group to hash things out.
Yep.
And then they move into norming.
So setting those ground rules, what's acceptable, who does what.
Precisely. Shared expectations and cohesion start to form, which sets the stage for performing, where the group can really hit their stride and focus on achieving their goals. And finally, there's adjourning, the end of the group's journey.
It's making me think about all the groups I'm part of and where they fall on this spectrum.
I bet. Maybe you're in the thick of storming right now with one of your groups.
Quite possibly. It's a good reminder that these stages aren't always linear. Groups can cycle back, get stuck. It's dynamic.
Absolutely. Now, we've talked about the what and the how of groups, but let's get to the why. Why are groups so fundamental to us humans?
Yeah, why do we crave this sense of belonging?
Well, groups satisfy some of our deepest psychological and social needs, that
Right.
need to belong, to feel connected to something larger than ourselves.
Right, like we're part of something bigger.
Exactly. They give us a sense of achievement, a framework for learning, and a feeling of security and support.
Like safety in numbers.
Exactly. And there's this fascinating study called the minimal groups paradigm that really highlights this. It shows how easily we favor our in-group, even when the distinction is totally random.
Okay, that sounds intriguing. Explain that one.
So imagine this, even something as simple as being assigned to a random team, say based on a coin flip, can make you favor your teammates and view the other team less favorably.
Wow, even if you have nothing else in common.
Exactly. That's the minimal groups paradigm in action. It shows the power of social identity, how much meaning we get from our group memberships.
It makes you think about all those little divisions we create all the time and how that us versus them thinking can creep in so easily.
Absolutely. And it's something to be mindful of because it can have both positive and negative consequences.
Okay, so we're primed for groups. They go through these stages and they fulfill deep needs. Now let's get to the juicy stuff, those fascinating rules of group dynamics that often operate below the surface.
One of your sources actually lays out 10 rules based on years of research. They're not just hunches, they're backed by evidence.
Hit me with rule number 1.
Rule number 1, groups can arise from practically nothing, just a tiny shared interest or even just proximity.
So even the flimsiest excuse can trigger that Wimsween feel.
It seems so. Now, rule number 2 dives into initiation rites those rituals or tests groups often have for new members.
Oh yeah, like hazing rituals?
Unfortunately, sometimes yes. But research shows that going through these rites, no matter how silly or challenging they seem, actually increases how much we value the group.
Interesting. So the harder you work to get, the more exclusive and therefore valuable it feels. Makes you think about those hazing rituals in a whole new light.
It does. As awful as they are, there's clearly a psychological mechanism at play.
Yeah.
But moving on to rule number 3, this is a big one. Conformity. Once we're in a group, those unwritten norms, those rules of behavior become super powerful.
Like the classic Ashline experiment, right?
Yeah.
Where people conform to the group's obviously wrong answer just to fit in.
Precisely. It's a stark reminder of how strong the pressure to conform can be.
Wow, makes you wonder how often we do that without even realizing it.
Right. And rule number 4 highlights the consequences of not conforming. It says, learn the ropes or be ostracized, basically fit in or get kicked out.
So it's a delicate balance.
Yeah.
You need to fit in, but you also need to...
Understand the power of roles. That's rule number 5. You become your job. Think of the Stanford prison experiment,
Oh yeah, wasn't that the one where...
where participants took on the roles of guards and prisoners so intensely that they had to stop the study early.
That's right. They were supposed to go for 2 weeks, but had to shut it down after just 6 days because it got so out of hand.
Exactly. Participants got so caught up in their roles they lost sight of themselves.
It's a bit terrifying when you think about it, but it highlights how powerful those roles are in shaping our behavior, even in everyday groups.
Absolutely. And then rule number 6 is about how leaders emerge. And it might surprise you. They don't start by bucking the system. They gain trust by first conforming to group norms.
Really? So it's not about being a maverick from day one.
Yeah.
You have to earn your stripes, first show that you get it before you can start changing things.
Exactly. It's about building relationships and trust before introducing new ideas. Now, rules 7 and 8 highlight that double-edged sword of groups. They can both boost and hinder performance.
How so?
Well, rule number 7 says groups can improve performance. Think of athletes training together or musicians in an orchestra. That presence of others can push us to excel.
Like having a workout buddy to keep you motivated.
Precisely. But then there's rule number 8, social loafing. When individual contributions get lost in the mix, people tend to slack off.
Oh yeah, the classic someone else will do it
Ooh,
mentality.
Yeah, exactly. And then rule number 9, it's about the grapevine.
The office gossip mill.
Kind of, but it's actually more than just gossip. Research suggests around 80% of the information shared through the grapevine is true.
Wow. I wouldn't have guessed it was that high.
Yeah.
Maybe we shouldn't be so quick to dismiss those water cooler conversations then.
Maybe not. And finally, rule number 10, groups breed competition.
Why is that? I mean, don't groups make us want to work together?
You'd think so, but research shows that even if people are cooperative on their own, put them in a them versus us situation, and that rivalry quickly emerges.
Like we see in sports or politics or even just between different departments at work.
Exactly. It's a reminder that group dynamics can be powerful forces for both good and bad.
So we've got these 10 insightful rules. Now let's shift gears and look at the structure of groups, because there's obviously some order to all this madness.
Right. There are key elements that give groups their backbone. One of your sources highlights 4 main components: roles, norms, status, and cohesiveness.
Okay, let's break those down. Roles are like the expected behavior of different members, right?
Exactly. Each person plays a part, whether it's the leader, the organizer, the creative thinker. These roles bring stability and predictability.
And norms are those unspoken rules we talked about earlier, the do's and don'ts of the group.
Precisely. They shape behavior even if they're not written down. Think about a group you belong to. What are those unspoken norms? How do they influence how people interact?
Ooh, that's a good one for our listeners to ponder. Now, what about status?
Status is about the pecking order, the social standing within the group. Some members hold more sway than others.
And lastly, there's cohesiveness, which I'm guessing is about how tight-knit the group is.
Exactly. It's the level of attraction and unity, how much they value being part of the group and feel connected to each other.
So a highly cohesive group is like a well-oiled machine, everyone working together seamlessly.
Right. And another one of your sources emphasizes how important communication is in building that cohesiveness. It's the lifeline of any group.
Makes sense. Without clear, open communication, things fall apart pretty quickly. I'm curious, what do they say about the nuances of communication within groups? What stood out to you?
Well, they made a point about how different modes of communication can really affect the dynamics of a group. Face-to-face versus telephone versus online. Each one has its own challenges and opportunities.
Like you lose a lot of those subtle social cues when you're not physically together.
Exactly. And they talked about how leadership style really impacts the flow of communication. Is it top-down or more decentralized and open?
Right. A controlling leader can really stifle communication and creativity.
Absolutely. And they dove into interaction patterns, too. Who talks to whom, how often, and in what way?
Are some members dominating, or is it more balanced?
Right. And it looks like those more group-centered patterns where everyone participates actively are generally more effective.
A more democratic approach where everyone feels comfortable sharing their ideas is the way to go.
It seems so. And of course, things like the size of the group, the level of interpersonal attraction, even the physical arrangement of the space can all impact those patterns.
So many factors at play.
It's complex. And speaking of complex, let's talk about cohesion a bit more. This same source called it a double-edged sword.
Interesting, because cohesion's good, right? It helps groups work together and get things done.
Absolutely. It brings a lot of benefits. Goal attainment, member satisfaction, commitment, increased self-confidence.
Yeah.
But there's a flip side, too. Yeah, too much cohesion can lead to excessive conformity, silencing dissent, creating dependence on the group.
So like anything too much of a good thing can be bad.
Yeah,
You need that balance of unity and individual critical thinking.
exactly. And their research found that proximity, similarity, and shared values are big drivers of interpersonal attraction, which is the foundation of cohesion.
So if you spend a lot of time with people who are similar to you and share your values, you're more likely to form strong bonds. But you might also miss out on those diverse perspectives.
Right. You can get stuck in an echo chamber. It's a tricky balance. And of course, we can't forget about conflict. It's an inevitable part of group life.
Right. No matter how well a group gets along, there are always going to be disagreements.
Exactly. But one of your sources makes a really important distinction between destructive conflict and constructive conflict.
So it's not about avoiding conflict altogether, but about managing it effectively.
Right. Destructive conflict leads to hostility and disruption, while constructive conflict can actually fuel problem solving and growth. It's all about how you approach those disagreements.
Okay, that makes sense. But sometimes it feels like conflict can escalate so quickly, even in groups that seem pretty chill.
And that's what's so fascinating about this topic. They talk about research showing how a casual crowd can turn into a mob under the right circumstances.
Okay, that is a little scary. It's a good reminder that even when things seem calm on the surface, those group dynamics are always bubbling away underneath.
Precisely. And understanding those dynamics can help us navigate those situations more effectively, both as individuals and as group members.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground already. I'm feeling like I have a whole new lens for understanding groups.
Me too. And
Um,
we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore.
Right. We still need to dive into how culture shapes group dynamics and then zoom out to look at those large-scale examples of collective behavior.
Looking forward to it.
Let's take a quick pause here and come back to unpack all of that.
Welcome back. We're ready to dig deeper into the fascinating world of groups. And where do we go from here?
Well, we've talked about the building blocks of groups, those individual dynamics. But let's zoom out a bit now and think about how culture influences those dynamics.
Yeah, culture, it's like this invisible force shaping so much of how we interact.
Totally. And one of the sources really emphasized how those shared values, beliefs, traditions, all those things we often lump under culture.
They have a huge impact on the nitty-gritty of how a group actually functions.
Absolutely. It's like the water we swim in. We don't even realize it's there, but it shapes everything.
And they pointed to the specific challenges and opportunities of multicultural groups, where you have this mix of diverse values and communication styles.
Right. Imagine trying to make a decision or even just have a casual conversation when everyone's coming from different cultural backgrounds with different assumptions about how things should work.
It can be a recipe for both richness and friction.
Totally makes sense.
Yeah.
And I bet there are tons of companies and organizations out there grappling with how to navigate this effectively.
Oh, I'm sure. It's a huge topic, especially in today's world. And, while we're talking about the nitty-gritty of groups, I did want to mention something else. The source brought up the measurement of group dynamics.
Oh, yeah, the idea that we can actually measure these things, not just rely on intuition or observation.
Exactly. There are all these different scales and tools designed to assess things like group climate, cohesion, engagement.
So you could actually get data on how your team is functioning.
Right. And the source argued that this kind of measurement can be really valuable for understanding what's working well and where there's room for improvement.
So we can use these insights to tweak things and become more effective as a group.
Exactly. Now, we've been mainly focusing on the internal dynamics of groups, but what happens when we zoom out even further and look at collective behavior on a larger scale?
Ah, yes, time to enter the realm of crowds, mobs, mass society, and even things like fashion trends. It's amazing how human behavior can be shaped by these larger social forces.
Right. One of your sources dives into social identity theory. That idea that we define ourselves partly through the groups we belong to.
Right. It's like our group memberships become part of our identity.
And this ties in with those in-group biases we talked about earlier. We naturally categorize ourselves and others into groups, and we want to feel good about the groups we belong to.
So it's like this drive for positive social identity.
Exactly. Which can have both positive and negative consequences. On the one hand, it can create a sense of solidarity and purpose. But on the other hand, it can lead to prejudice and intergroup conflict.
So it's a powerful force that can be channeled for good or for ill. Now, speaking of groups on a grander scale, what about crowds? Those temporary gatherings of people sharing a common focus?
Right? Like concerts, protests, sporting events, or even just people watching a street performer.
Crowds can be exciting, but they can also be unpredictable. It's like there's this anonymity that can make people act differently than they would on their own.
One of your sources talks about the classical theory of crowd behavior, which suggests that crowds create a kind of collective mind. Individual rationality goes out the window.
It's like everyone gets swept up in the moment. A bit unsettling when you think about it.
Definitely. And then there's convergence theory, which argues that crowd behavior is more about like-minded individuals coming together.
So it's not just random chaos, but a convergence of people who are already predisposed to act in a certain way.
Right. And this source also distinguishes between active and inactive crowds.
So active crowds are actually doing something like protesting or rioting, while inactive crowds are more passively observing, like an audience at a concert.
Exactly. But even those seemingly passive crowds can shift to active pretty quickly depending on the situation.
Like if something unexpected happens, that triggers a strong emotional response.
Right. And they also touched on other forms of collective behavior like mobs, mass society, and fashion.
Okay, let's break those down. First up, mobs, and I'm guessing we're not talking about the friendly flash mob kind here.
Definitely not. Mobs are usually driven by intense emotions like anger or fear, and they can be quite destructive.
Right. Think of lynch mobs or those vigilante groups that form in times of social unrest.
Exactly. And then mass society, this refers to those large-scale industrialized societies where people can feel isolated and disconnected.
So it's like that sense of being lost in the crowd without any real sense of belonging.
Right. And this source suggests that mass society can actually make people more susceptible to crowd behavior and things like propaganda.
Because they're searching for something to fill that void.
Exactly. It's a bit of a vicious cycle. And then there's fashion, which might seem frivolous, but it actually reflects some of those same underlying group dynamics we've been talking about.
Oh, totally. Fashion is all about conformity, social signaling, wanting to fit in, but also wanting to stand out.
Exactly. It's fascinating how trends can spread so quickly influenced by everything from celebrities to our own peer groups.
It's like fashion is this language we use to communicate about who we are and what we value.
Precisely. Now, before we wrap up this section, I do want to touch briefly on social integration. It's another key concept from your sources.
Right. Social integration. It's about how all those group dynamics we've been talking about, the norms, the roles, the status hierarchies,
They all work together to create order and predictability within a group.
which in turn helps to reduce conflict and make the group more effective.
Exactly. Of course, there's a balance to be struck here. We need conformity to some extent, but we don't want to stifle individuality either.
Right. It's that classic tension between the needs of the individual and the needs of the group.
A fascinating dilemma, and one that we probably won't ever fully resolve. But hey, that's what makes this whole topic so interesting, right?
Absolutely. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this section.
We have. It's time to take a breath and move on to our final thoughts.
Sounds good to me.
Huh.
Let's do it. Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been on quite a journey exploring the fascinating world of groups. I feel like we've just scratched the surface, but we've already uncovered so much.
I know, right? It's amazing how much is going on beneath the surface of our everyday interactions. All these dynamics shaping our behavior in ways we're not even aware of.
It really is a bit mind-blowing. So before we wrap things up, let's do a quick recap of some of the key takeaways and then leave our listeners with a final thought-provoking question for them to ponder.
Sounds good to me. Where do we even begin? There's so much to cover.
Well, let's start with that fundamental idea that groups are so much more than just collections of individuals. There's this unique energy, this synergy that emerges when people come together with a shared purpose.
Absolutely. And we explored how that synergy unfolds in those different stages of group development, from the initial forming stage where everyone's a bit unsure to the storming phase where conflicts inevitably arise.
Right. And how important it is to navigate those conflicts effectively, leading to the norming phase, where the group starts to gel and establish its own set of rules and expectations.
And ultimately, reaching that performing stage where the group can really hit its stride and achieve its goals. It's like a well-choreographed dance when it all comes together.
We also talked about why groups are so essential to us humans, how they fulfill some of our deepest psychological and social needs, like the need to belong, to achieve, to learn to feel secure and supported.
And we can't forget that mind-blowing minimal groups paradigm. We discussed how even the most arbitrary distinctions can trigger that in-group bias. It really highlights the power of social identity. how much our sense of self is tied to the groups we belong to.
It's a reminder that those us versus them dynamics are lurking everywhere, even when there's no logical reason for them. Now, I really loved those 10 rules of group dynamics we explored. They really brought to light some of those often hidden forces shaping our behavior in groups.
Like the impact of initiation rights, that sense of exclusivity, the powerful pull of conformity, the importance of understanding those unspoken norms, the way rules can shape our behavior, and how groups can both enhance and hinder performance.
Right? It's like walking a tightrope sometimes, finding that balance between individual expression and the needs of the group. And speaking of balance, we talked about how communication is key to fostering that sense of cohesion and making sure everyone's on the same page.
And how different modes of communication can really affect the dynamics, face-to-face versus online. And we also talked about leadership styles and how a leader who encourages open dialogue and active listening can make a world of difference.
And then there's conflict, which is just an inevitable part of group life.
Yeah.
But it's not all bad. We saw how constructive conflict can actually lead to growth and innovation if it's managed effectively.
Right. It's all about shifting our mindset from seeing conflict as a threat to seeing it as an opportunity.
And then we zoomed out to look at those larger scale forms of collective behavior like crowds, mobs, mass society, and even fashion trends.
Right. We explored how social identity theory helps explain why we gravitate towards certain groups and how those affiliations can shape our worldview. And we discussed different theories of crowd behavior like the classical theory and convergence theory, shedding light on why crowds can sometimes behave in unpredictable and even dangerous ways.
We also talked about social integration and how all those norms, roles, and status hierarchies work together to create order and predictability within a group, which is important for reducing conflict and promoting effectiveness. But we also acknowledge that there's a risk of too much conformity stifling individual creativity and critical thinking.
It's that age-old tension between the needs of the individual and the needs of the group, and it's something we'll probably continue to grapple with as long as humans exist.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. But before we say goodbye, I'd love to leave our listeners with a final thought-provoking question, something to chew on as they go about their day.
I like that.
Yeah.
What do you have in mind?
Well, we've spent all this time talking about how groups influence us, but I think it's important to flip the script and ask, how do you influence the groups you're part of?
Oh, that's a great question. It's so easy to feel like we're just cogs in the machine. But the truth is, we each have the power to shape the dynamics of the groups we belong to.
Right? It's all about becoming more aware of those dynamics and making conscious choices about how we want to show up in those different group settings. Do we want to lead? Do we want to follow? Do we want to conform? Do we want to challenge? Those are all valid choices.
And I think this newfound understanding of group dynamics can help us make those choices more intentionally and be more effective group members as a result.
I couldn't agree more. Well, that wraps up our deep dive into the endlessly fascinating world of groups. We hope you've enjoyed the journey as much as we have.
And that you'll continue to explore these powerful, often hidden forces that shape our social lives.
Until next time, happy grouping, everyone.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Your support helps us keep creating valuable content like this. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss an update. Join our community for more insights into psychology and personal development. Let's grow and learn together. See you in the next video.